So in this video, we are going to look at the three categories of muscles that we have. Now remember, we have muscle tissue and then we have muscles as organs. And by definition, tissues are groups of cells that work together, and an organ's a group of tissues that work together. And so when we talk about muscle, like we talk about skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle, we're talking about muscular tissue. And then those tissues work together with other types of connective tissue, nervous tissue, and epithelial tissue in order to make the organs. So when you think of your heart is an organ, but it has cardiac muscle tissue in it, as well as epithelial tissue, which are the membranes that make it up. When you think of something like your triceps, your biceps, these are organs that contain skeletal muscle tissue. So this is just kind of a review of the different types of muscle tissues and how they are defined. Now, in the case of muscles, muscle tissue, if you remember, they are named according to their appearance. And in another video where we talk about muscle structure, we talk about these patterns, these protein arrangements that are called sarcomeres. Well, in the case of striated, this is a picture of skeletal muscle, and skeletal muscle is striated, meaning when you look at it, you can see stripes. Well, in the case of striated, in order to be a muscle cell, which we call a muscle fiber, because remember, when you think of the word cell, it makes you think of something that's a circle. So muscle cells aren't called muscle cells. Yes, they're cells, but they're not circular. So we tend to call them muscle fibers because they're long and skinny. Well, when you look at a muscle fiber, all muscle fibers have to have the same parts inside of them. If they didn't have the same parts, we couldn't call them muscle fibers. And all muscle fibers have the special protein pattern, the special protein arrangement that we call a sarcomere. It contains a thick protein called myosin, it contains a thin protein called actin, and they're attached to the sides by these things called Z-bands. Well, every muscle fiber has sarcomeres in it. They all have the same muscle arrangement, they all have the same proteins that make them up. But in the case of cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle, these muscles have to be strong. So the sarcomere proteins have to be thicker. And in the case of cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle, these Z-bands, these protein arrangements are so thick that you can see them. And that's what gives you this striped pattern that you see. So if you striated, that means it has these thick protein fibers because these proteins need to be strong. Your skeleton is lifting, your skeletal muscles are lifting things, they're holding you together. Your heart has to pump, 70 times a minute your entire life under lots of pressure. So these muscles need to be strong. So these proteins are thick. So they're thick enough that you can see them. And that's what it means when we say something is striated. Cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle are striated. Now, smooth muscle, which is also called visceral muscle, smooth muscle still has these same proteins in them. It still has the sarcomeres and the same arrangements, but smooth muscle doesn't have to be as strong. Smooth muscle does something called peristalsis, which you guys know of as pulsing. And smooth muscle is found in organs that have tubes in them. And it kind of pulses in order to push things through those tubes. It doesn't have to be really strong. It doesn't need a lot of force. So therefore, the protein fibers in smooth muscle, which is also called visceral muscle, doesn't have to be really thick. So therefore, even though those protein fibers are there, even though the sarcomere pattern is the same, since the protein fibers aren't as thick, you're not going to see the stripes. So if you see that something is striated, that means that it's a strong, thick muscle fiber, and it's got these thick proteins, and the proteins are thick enough that you can see them. And that's what gives them the striped pattern. If you see smooth muscle, the proteins are still there, and the proteins are still in the same pattern. They're just not as thick, so we can't see them. So the muscle has a smooth appearance to them. So in the example of cardiac muscle, as you guys know, cardiac muscle is what makes up your heart. Now, not your blood vessels. Your blood vessels are smooth muscle. Your heart beats, your blood vessels pulse. There's a reason we use two different terms because they're two different muscles that work in two different ways. And so in the case of your cardiac muscle, it's found in the heart only. And in my video where I discuss the heart and the chambers and how it works, it goes into cardiac muscle in a lot more detail. But for this purpose here, we're just looking at the just general characteristics of the three categories of muscle tissue. So cardiac muscle is the tissue that makes up the organ, which is the heart. Now, in the case of cardiac muscle, it is involuntary. Now, what that means is skeletal muscle is voluntary. Cardiac muscle and smooth muscle are involuntary. This is a term that we call innervation. Basically, what part of the brain controls these muscles? You have two parts to your brain, the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Those are the two largest parts of your brain. Most of the time when people think of the brain, they think of the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. And your cerebrum controls involuntary muscle movement, meaning when you were born, these things were working. You did not have to teach your heart how to beat. You did not have to teach your blood vessels to pulse. You did not have to teach your intestines to pulse in order to push food through. So these are what we call involuntary muscles, and they're controlled by your cerebrum. Now, cardiac muscle is striated. Now, with this picture here, I know it's a little difficult to see the striations, but the striations would be found going back and forth across the cardiac muscle. And those, again, are the patterns that we have. And so we would have these striations that are going back and forth across. Now, cardiac muscle is mononucleated, meaning each cell only has one nucleus. Because cardiac muscle is actually a little deceiving, even though when you look at this picture, it looks like you have a lot of really long muscle cells. And remember, muscle cells are called muscle fibers. Cardiac muscle is not what it seems. Cardiac muscle is actually a bunch of little cells that have fused together. If you'll notice, you'll see these dark lines here. There's a dark line right here. There's a dark line up here. And so we have, let me get a different color. We have this box right here. Okay. This is one cardiac muscle fiber. So even though it looks like it's this really long muscle fiber, cardiac muscle are actually a bunch of little cells that all glue together and act like one big cell. So each cell is mononucleated. Each cell has its own nucleus that makes it up. And then the cells, as you can see, branch. And these branches, these openings, are these things called anastomes. So you can see this little opening right here. Okay. If I can get my cursor to work. We have this little opening right here. That's what's called an anastome. And I always compare these to, think about trampolines. Your heart has to beat your entire life. And you guys know, jumping up and down, you get tired. So think of anastomes as trampolines. Okay? You've all seen the big outside trampolines, and they've got a lot of space between them and the ground. And that allows you to get a lot of bounce. That allows you to get a lot of height. Well, by having space between the muscle fibers of the heart, it gives that heart that extra bounce. So basically the heart doesn't have to beat or doesn't have to work as hard. Because you guys, if you've ever been on a trampoline before, when you first start bouncing, it takes a moment, but then you get that momentum and you get that bounce, you get higher and higher and higher. Well, your heart's the same way. So by having these little gaps here, called anastomes, the root word stomo, right here, means mouth or opening. And so by having these gaps, now cardiac muscle is still densely packed. The cells are still stacked on top of each other, but they do have these small gaps in between them, basically so like a trampoline, it's going to help them bounce. Now, like I mentioned, cardiac muscle is deceiving because it looks like one really long muscle fiber, but in reality it's a bunch of short muscle fibers connected together. And those connection points are these things called intercalated disc. So these dark lines you see in this picture, like right there and right there, Those are intercalated discs. This right here is one cell, and this is a different cell. But it looks like it's all one really long cell. And that's why cardiac muscle can be mononucleated. Since the cells are small, one nucleus can do all the work that that cell needs it to do. Which then leads us to smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is found in your internal organs, and a lot of your internal organs have tubes in them. And so your digestive system, your alimentary canal, is one large tube, and it pulses. Your stomach pulses to help churn food and to smash food. Your intestines pulse to help push what's called chyme, this fluidy, nutrient-rich liquid through your intestines. Your blood vessels pulse. You have tubes in your kidneys called nephrons that pulse. You have tubes in your liver called hepatic ducts that pulse. So any tube that you have in your body is made up of smooth muscle, and smooth muscle pulses. Now your diaphragm is also made of smooth muscle. It's not a tube, but your diaphragm does pulse. It goes up and down, and that's what allows you to breathe. Well, in the case of smooth muscle gets its name because you can't see the proteins. The proteins are still there. They're still in the same sarcomere arrangement. However, they don't have to be as thick. Your smooth muscle isn't holding things together or holding you up like your skeletal muscle. It doesn't have to produce a lot of pressure to push blood through your entire body like your heart does. So that's why we say your heart beats and your blood vessels pulse. And since they're just this nice rhythm, it's like a wave going onto the beach. This nice rhythmic pulsing doesn't have to be really powerful. It doesn't have to be really strong. So even though it has the same sarcomere arrangement, these myofibrils, and it has the same proteins, the proteins just aren't as thick. So therefore we can't see them. So therefore we call this smooth muscle. It's also involuntary. You did not have to learn how to use them. And here's this term I was using, peristalsing, which is what a lot of you think of as pulsing. Now, when people talk about muscles, the main example they use is skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is the strongest muscle you have in your body. It is the thickest muscles that you have in your body, and it's the longest type of muscle fiber. As you can see in this picture here, we have skeletal muscle. You can see that skeletal muscle is striated. You can see the stripes very, very, very easily. You can see that they are densely packed. It's like stacking bricks on top of each other. That's going to give it strength. You don't have a lot of space in between the cells. And these are voluntary. Now, cardiac muscle and smooth muscle were involuntary, and they're controlled by the part of your brain called the cerebrum. And involuntary is basically what a lot of people call instinctive. They just work. Okay. Well, skeletal muscle is voluntary. It's controlled by a different part of your brain. And that part of your brain is called the cerebellum. It's actually kind of towards the back and bottom of your brain. And your cerebellum controls what we call voluntary muscle. Basically what this means is you had to learn how to use skeletal muscle. You had to learn to turn over. You had to learn to sit up. You had to learn to pull yourself up. You had to learn to walk. You had to learn to hold things in your hand. You had to learn to talk. All of these are skeletal muscles. You had to learn how to use them. And that's what it means to be voluntary. Now, skeletal muscle is is multinucleated. As you can see, these dark purple dots, these are nuclei. In the case of skeletal muscle cells, okay, in the case of skeletal muscle fibers, these muscle fibers are really long. And they're so long that one nucleus can't provide the genetic information, the proteins for the entire cell. So in the case of our skeletal muscle, this is one of the few cells we have in our body that have more than one nucleus. And again, it's because they're so long that one nucleus couldn't keep up with the protein demand. Skeletal muscle gets its name because it's attached to a bone in some way. And later on in this video, we're going to talk about skeletal muscle attachment. Now, because they do attach to a bone, there's two ways that they can attach. One is not common. It's what's called direct or fleshy attachment. This is where the muscle literally attaches to the bone. Now, this is found in places where we don't use that muscle that often. So, for example, you have what's called the epicranius. Epi meaning above, cranius meaning cranium. If you put your hands right on the top of your head, you are touching what's called the epicranius or epicranial muscle. This is an example of a direct attachment. If you put your hand on top of your head and try to wiggle that muscle, nothing really happens. The epicranius is kind of a vestigial muscle for us. We don't really use it that much anymore. And so with direct or fleshy attachments, these are found on muscles that we don't use that often, and they're not at risk at being damaged. Most of your skeletal muscles do what's called an indirect attachment. They use tendons. Remember, we have things called tendons and ligaments. They're both dense, regular connective tissue, lots of strong collagen fibers in them. Well, ligaments are part of our skeletal system. They attach bone to bone. That's what holds our joints together. Tendons are what attaches muscle to bone. So most of our skeletal muscles attach to our bones using tendons. Tendons are incredibly strong. They're very hard to damage. And so we don't have to worry about the muscle getting damaged in some way. Now, in the case of a skeletal muscle, skeletal muscles are what move bones. And they have three main parts, what's called the origin, the insertion, and the body. If you think of your biceps brachii, the biceps brachii is what most people think of when they think of a muscle. It's the muscle that allows you to bend your arm. Well, it has a top and it has a bottom. Well, your biceps brachii attaches to your clavicle and your scapula, your shoulder area at the top. And then down at the bottom, it attaches to the ulna and the radius. Well, up at the top where it attaches to your shoulder, that is what we call the origin. And down at the bottom where it attaches to the ulna and the radius, that's what we call the insertion. Because when you bend your arm, your shoulder doesn't move. The muscle, your biceps brachii, brings the ulna and radius up. When people flex their muscles, you're seeing what's called the body. When people eat meat, they're eating the muscle of that animal. And since muscles often rub up against bone, many muscles have what's called a bursa sac beneath them. Kind of think of them as an oil can. And so when the muscle flexes, it kind of presses on this sac, and this greasy fluid helps come out. And that kind of creates lubrication between the muscle and the bone, so the bone doesn't begin to scrape or tear the muscle. And then lastly, skeletal muscles are grouped according to their function. Because remember, skeletal muscles move bones, and if you move bones, that means you have joints. And joints are divided into groups, and the muscles are also divided into groups. So we have flexors and extensors. A flexor muscle is going to be a muscle that bends a joint, like your biceps brachii bends your elbow. Your biceps femoris bends your knee. And an extensor is going to straighten that joint. So remember, muscles work in pairs. Muscles can only contract, they have to be pulled back to normal. So every muscle has a partner that works opposite of it, and that's what's called an opposing pair or an antagonistic pair. So flexors are going to bend a joint, and extensors are going to straighten a joint. So your biceps brachii in your arm would be a flexor, and your triceps brachii in your arm would be an extensor. We then have abductors and abductors. When you abduct something, you take it away. When you add something, you put it together. Well, abductors are going to take a joint away from your body. So like when you raise your hand, that would be an abductor. Okay? You're moving your arm away from your body. When you bring your arm back down, that would be an adductor. Okay? Rotators are going to cause things to twist and turn. Supinators and pronators are referring to your arm movements. When you stand with your palms up, like what's up, that's a supinator. And when you twist your arms so your palms are facing backwards, that's a pronator. Likewise, dorsiflexors and plantar flexors tend to refer to your feet. Dorsiflexor would be like if you are standing on your heels, and plantar flexors would be like you're standing on your toes. And again, remember, they all are antagonistic pairs. They have partners that work opposite of each other. So as you can see in this picture, okay, we have flexors bending something and extensors. Here's my flexor, it's bending my arm, and extensors are straightening it. Adduction would be like you raising your arm, and adduction would bring you bringing your arm back. Supination is palm up, like what's up? Pronation is palm down. One I did not mention, which is circumduction, this is found at your hips and your shoulders. That's the ability to move things in a circle. Okay. Rotation, you know, shaking your head. Okay. Then we have elevation and depression, which I also did not talk about. Elevation, as you can see here, would be like shrugging your shoulders, bringing something up. Depression would be bringing something down. And then eversion and inversion, okay, it's just basically movements.